Thanks for joining. We're going to be discussing part of the diet dogmas that will be coming out as a book, hopefully soon. And so when we start talking about diet dogmas, we're talking about all of the things that we think about as being fad diets. And they're not really fads because they seem to last much longer than most fads would happen to last. What they really are is in the way in which we approach them, it tends to be very much similar to religious practices, which is why I like to think about those as being dogmatic in practice, and why we like to talk about them as being diet dogmas. But it's not just about what we're eating, but it's also about when we're eating, in which we have various types of patterns of eating, such as intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, or dieting mimicking fasting. Well, what's the difference? What is the difference between intermittent fasting? What is the difference between intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating? What is the difference between intermittent fasting and dieting mimicking fasting? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
So when we start looking at this idea, there's three things that we have to look at. Are we changing when we're eating during the day? If we're changing when we're eating during the day, this is time-restricted eating. We usually break it into when we eat and when we fast. So why some people think about this as being intermittent fasting when it's not really intermittent fasting. There are the three prominent forms of time-restricted eating, such as the 8-16, where I'm going to eat for 8 hours and I'm going to fast for 16. The 12-12, where I'm going to eat for 12 and fast for 12. Or one of the more popular ones, which is the 24, which is where I'm going to fast for 20 hours and eat for 4 hours. We can think about this time-restricted eating kind of like 3 square meals a day, where we're going to only eat during the time that we have meal times, and we're going to be fasting when we don't have those meals. Some people have taken this to the extreme where they will only eat 1 meal out of the day. The other way we can think about this is, am I changing how much I'm eating each day of the week as opposed to when I'm going to eat during the day? This right here is intermittent fasting, where I will have fasting periods followed by normal eating periods, or restricted eating followed by normal eating periods. This is not time-restricted eating. This is intermittent fasting. The other way we can think about this time in terms of restriction of meals is doing a dieting that's mimicking fasting. This is where I'm going to eat small meals frequently throughout the day. Some people think about this as being grazing, but I'm not really grazing. What I'm doing is I'm having very, very small meals, and the small meals I'm having are going to provide me with the essential amino acids, the essential fatty acids, and the carbohydrates that are necessary for me to maintain my metabolism without undergoing large amounts of tissue breakdown throughout the day to meet my fuel needs as well as my nutrient needs in order to maintain my normal homeostatic metabolism. So what's the evidence? What do we know? Well, the first thing we have to stipulate is that there's no one way to do these diets. And because there's no one way to do these diets, most of the times when we're talking about these diets, we tend to use and interchange the use of the terms intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, where we tend to think of time-restricted eating as a form of intermittent fasting when it's not really a form of intermittent fasting. Given what we understand about this, what can we say in terms of overall health outcomes? Well, most of the evidence that we have in terms of overall health outcomes comes from the studies looking at metabolic effects of using these diets, where we see distinct metabolic changes that come about from following these diets. Recently, we have noticed that these diets, in combination with macronutrient changes, can also lead to weight loss, where we notice that those individuals who follow either a time-restricted eating, an intermittent fasting, or a dieting mimicking fasting, where nutrient changes, where macronutrient densities are changed to increase protein intake while reducing carbohydrate intake, have seen more significant weight loss, as well as maintenance of fat-free mass relative to loss of fat mass, even if the caloric balance does not change. What else can we say about this? Well, we do know that there are distinct metabolic effects that come about from following these diets. The distinct metabolic effects coming about from these diets tend to relate to changes in reactive oxidative species, as well as aerobic metabolic effects that take place due to dietary changes. What we have to do is we have to stipulate that most of the changes that we see here are not restricted to diet alone, as changes in diet are usually linked with changes in physical activity and exercise. But we do see that following these diets in conjunction with other lifestyle changes, we see an improvement in cognitive functions. We see an improvement in insulin sensitivity and neuroplasticity. We see an increase in parasympathetic tone, as well as an improvement in mitochondrial functions within the neurons of the nervous system. In the musculoskeletal system, in particular within the skeletal muscle, we will see an increase in metabolic flexibility, an improvement in mitochondrial functions, an increase in total numbers of mitochondria, an improvement in aerobic metabolism, an improvement in insulin sensitivity, an improvement in leptin sensitivity, an increase in lipolysis, an increase in anabolic responses, allowing for maintenance of fat-free mass during periods of weight loss while following either intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding, or dieting mimicking fasting. In terms of cardiovascular function, we see an increase in compliance of the arteries and the veins, allowing for better blood flow through the body. When combined with a reduction in atherosclerosis, we see an improvement in blood vessel functions, leading to a reduction in blood pressures. The reduction in blood pressures, along with the increase in compliance, leads to an increase in cardiac functions. We also see a reduction in C-reactive protein inflammation signals that also contribute to the reduction in atherosclerosis and the improvement in compliance seen following these diets in conjunction with other lifestyle changes, which include increase of activity or exercise. In terms of fat mass, we see a reduction in fat mass through an increase in lipolysis, breakdown of the lipids. We see an improvement in insulin sensitivity. We see a change in adipokine signalings, in particular changes in adiponectin, leptin, as well as changes in macrophage activation due to changes in adipokine signaling, which contribute to an overall reduction in stress signals and inflammation signals, allowing for improvements in overall metabolic functions. In terms of pancreatic functions, we see a normalization of insulin and glucagon, allowing for normalization of glucose metabolism and glucose regulation that is seen with the combination of improvements in insulin sensitivity at the skeletal muscles, at the adipose tissue, as well as at the liver. Along with an improvement of insulin sensitivity at the liver, we see an increase in ketone formation, as well as an increase in ROS clearances coming from the liver. The ketone formations allow for an increase in ketogenic metabolism, reduction in overall ROS formations, and oxidative stress seen throughout the body. So what can we say? What can we say about time-restricted feeding? What can we say about intermittent fasting? What can we say about dieting that mimics fasting? There's limited evidence to show that any of those dietary methods is any more effective or any more efficient than other modes of dieting as relates to weight loss, especially when combined with macronutrient changes that lead to a lower carbohydrate intake, a higher protein intake, that allows for ketogenic principles to come about. We do know that when combined with lower carbohydrate and ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding appears to be very effective and very efficient in inducing weight loss, as well as changes in overall metabolic health. The changes in long-term health seem to be very similar to what we see in other dietary methods, particularly when combined with exercise and improvements in physical activity, along with other changes in lifestyle. It must be stated that even though it's plausible to have benefits coming strictly from these diets, there are almost no long-term studies or studies to show follow-up on the continuation of the benefits following the termination of these dietary methods.